We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga and the section titled The Yoga of Integral Knowledge, in which Sri Aurobindo redefined the yoga of knowledge as it is traditionally known, widened its scope, and brought it in alignment with the larger objective of the integral yoga itself. And so one has to view it as one of the three legs which build the practice of the integral yoga. The other two being the yoga of works, but as aligned for the integral yoga, and the yoga of devotion and love, but again aligned for the integral objective. In the chapters we have studied so far, he brought us also to the goal of the approach of integral knowledge, showed how one can self attain to what would be called self-realization through many of its modes and aspects. And each of them would be so overwhelming as an experience that one could stop there and say, this is it. But since our goal is an integral realization, we have to always go further to the highest poise, the deepest truths, and the most complete realization. And we saw that it is not enough to have the height, but one has to have also the width, which embraces the totality of the cosmos, including this world, which we find from that extreme to be either superficial or only a partial or even unreal expression of the self in its height. And so some correction is required, which involves the knowledge of the self in its deepest and most essential, which is at the same time most embracing. And this was the theme of the previous chapter, titled The Realization of Satchidananda. That the self knows itself purely as an existence that is utterly conscious and a consciousness that is utterly blissful, which is the only existence. And it is in that consciousness that we know both the poise of the self in its freedom from the world and the poise of the self as it moves to manifest the world. This is the goal we have set. And now Sri Aurobindo brings us to the practical problem involved in this. The consciousness in which we live, that is our mind, which is self-aware, is unable to experience this. There is a consciousness, a supra-mental, beyond the mind, which can experience this easily. But the consciousness in which we live, it is unable. It can catch an aspect of the self, it can get into some glimpse, however partial, but it is unable to get to this totality of the experience of Satchidananda. And what are the difficulties which limit or prevent this mental consciousness from being able to attain to that? These he now maps out before moving on into how to get over those difficulties and have that completeness of the realization. So this chapter now is titled Difficulties of the Mental Being. Always, he summarizes where we are in our discussion in the first paragraph and then moves from there in the direction intended in this chapter. He begins like this: we have come to this stage in our development of the path of knowledge that we began by affirming the realization of our pure self, pure existence, above the terms of mind, life and body as the first object of this yoga. But we now affirm that this is not sufficient, and that we must also realize the self or Brahman in its essential modes and primarily in its triune reality as Satchidananda. So we started by the object of the path of knowledge, which is realization of pure self, pure existence, which is beyond mind, life and body. But as we went into the discussion and went deep enough, we realized that alone is not enough, because it is possible to have an experience of the self, but which is not complete, or which leaves you powerless or incapable to deal with the world as it is. And then you have to either abandon it or simply ignore it. And there are many who have come to this, who then find in their conclusion that that's all that is possible. I recently came across a fascinating book which I hope to read from either next week or the week after, where this lady describes how she was living a very ordinary life with no obvious interest in spirituality. And then one day she says, her mind blew a fuse. Her mind as if switched off. And suddenly all that she saw was, and she uses this word, space, empty space. All objects were made of empty space. And she describes in a fascinating narration how she approached an elevator and all she saw was empty space, herself as empty space, choosing to be or pretending to be this person, looking at elevator which is empty space, accepting to recognize it as elevator, entering empty space into empty space, and so on. It's quite a fascinating description, and she has a peculiar way of formulating it which is quite engaging. But at the end of it, the conclusion she came to, she says it was painful because she felt the whole universe and the pain of the universe pouring into her, unable to handle it. And so she says all that happened was she awoke to a kind of enlightenment, but the result was intense suffering. At people, she could sense deeply what they were and the deeper motivations behind, and the whole personality was like an appearance, fake, unreal, pretentious, and she could see behind what were the deeper motives and drives, and everything was a charade. So what does she do as a career today is to meet people in a form of counseling, describing what is happening inside them and helping them to get free of their insanity, so to say. So the book itself is called Tools for Sanity. and she gives 4 tools. I have not seen the rest, but it seems to be very engagingly written. Point being, although she uses a vocabulary describing space and emptiness, what she had as an experience was a glimpse of the self. And seeing the self in the world was for her overwhelming enough time. The struggle with all of this suffering which overwhelms her, and on a cosmic scale, and all that which followed. And so she said it was quite unlike what she had read or heard, that experience of the self is beautiful, it is blissful, and all she had was pain and suffering, an overwhelming sense of meaninglessness. What would one conclude seeing this? And she stops there thinking this is it. She has achieved enlightenment. So she concludes that's all there is. But if we have the deeper background, one would say, oh yes, it's a very good first step. Now you must go to something deeper. Something which is more complete. Something in which you will see how the world is form of self. And not merely a pretentious, superficial appearance. But unfortunately she had no such basis, or the people that she went to could not help her to that. But still, what she presents is fascinating, and I will perhaps read from it the next time that we meet. So this, we recognize, is not enough. And he says, we now affirm that this is not sufficient, and that we must also realize the self or Brahman in its essential modes, and primarily in its triune reality as Satchidananda. So all the modes of the self, all the facets and aspects which we have covered earlier, impersonality, personality, oneness, multiplicity, and then behind them all, in its most essential triple reality of Satchidananda, in which we can know the totality from the heights to the widths to the most surface layers of the self. All are in essence Satchidananda. So he says, not only pure existence, but pure consciousness and pure bliss of its being and consciousness are the reality of the self and the essence of Brahman. You will see him repeated using the terms self or Brahman. Reality of self, essence of Brahman. He keeps the two always next to each other. And that's because these are two different facets of our individual experience of the self. One where we turn in and we discover ourselves to be in our essence that, and so we call it self, the true self, inmost self, deepest or highest self. The other, which is a going out and looking at things deeper and more essentially until we recognize the underlying reality, and in that it includes all things in its totality, and so we call it Brahman. But that same is self subjectively and self is Brahman objectively. They are just two different ways of looking at something which comes back to the same one at the root. So reality of the self is how we experience in ourselves, and the perception of things outside as Brahman and the Satchidananda as essence of Brahman. Now what does that mean in practice to recognize Sat, Chit and Ananda, pure existence, pure consciousness and pure bliss as the reality of the universe? It means when you look at an object, you do not stop with the form of the appearance, but you are able to perceive that the form itself is form of energy, and an energy which is consciousness, a consciousness that is blissful, self-existent and essential. And everything that we see in the universe is seen to be this blissful consciousness playing in its energy to create as if in foam all these forms, or to represent its delight in and through all these forms. The text of which we had seen last time when we read from the passage of the delight of works. Everything is seen to be Ananda, and all objects therefore are nothing but, if we may use this analogy, crystallization of the play of Ananda, serving only the purpose of manifesting and unfolding increasing possibilities of Ananda. And in this way we experience not only ourselves, but all the universe. So this is the direction in which we are now aiming the path of knowledge. We do not stop short, but take it all the way. Further, he says, there are two kinds of realization of self, or Satchidananda. Now, even if we set ourselves as this as goal, to realize Satchidananda, there are two directions within that. One which is passive, the other which is active. But not merely active, masterful of the active and the passive. So he describes these two now, and you will see not only it summarizes what was discussed, but in itself has a powerful experiential character. If we read this with a consciousness that opens and allows the words to convey their power, you will find it takes you in deeper into this direction of experience. So the first, one is that of the silent, passive, quietistic, self-absorbed, self-sufficient existence, consciousness, and delight. One, impersonal, without play of qualities, turned away from the infinite phenomenon of the universe, or viewing it with indifference and without participation. So this is the first experience, kind of experience of self, or Satchidananda. You will see the full list of qualities is held in one single sentence, all of which are of silence, stillness, and separation from movement. On the other side, the other is that of the same existence, consciousness, delight, sovereign, meaning ruling, free, lord of things, acting out of an inalienable calm, pouring itself out in infinite action and quality, out of an eternal self-concentration, the one supreme person holding in himself all this play of personality in a vast, equal impersonality, possessing the infinite phenomenon of the universe without attachment, but without any inseparable aloofness, with a divine mastery and an innumerable radiation of his eternal, luminous self-delight, as a manifestation which he holds, but by which he is not held, which he governs freely, and by which therefore he is not bound. So these are the two ways. Now you will see the two are naturally as if complementary. One seems to be turning away from the world, withdrawing to some kind of concentration and silence and self-absorption, indifferent to what it leaves behind. The other is the same consciousness from a poise of calm and silence and concentration, pouring out, mastering and controlling and enjoying the full manifestation. they seem to be complementary. One can almost see both as if sides of each other. But in the second, the calm of the first is held, is included. But as the focal point from out of which the whole movement of power and mastery emerges. In the first one, there is no play of qualities because everything is turned inward. In the second one, all qualities are included, but from a point not bound to the qualities. Now, our human experience of lordship is very different. If you study history and the play of power in the political, economic, or social domains, you will find there is always a tendency for power to accumulate in and around a few people who know how to wield it, eventually settling upon one person who is given the keys to all the power. But inevitably, this center of power, person or group, is bound by the very things that they control. The king has to ensure that in his exercise of power, he is seen to be fair. He is seen to be worthy of his position. His actions, if wrongly used, can even turn the whole energy of the system against him and create a rebellion. Very quickly, he loses all sense of privacy. And in a short time, he recognizes that he is bound by the system that he rules. Every time we see in history a spiritual person creating an institution, if nothing else, simply to propagate his teaching or to create a space in which his followers can put into practice, very quickly the institution now binds the person. There are many well-known, famous teachers, spiritual, semi-spiritual, semi-social, whatever form they may take. A large part of their energy goes in maintaining what they have created. The moment they move into creating either a following or an institution, they have to raise money to maintain the institution. They have to keep in touch with the followers and build new followers, otherwise you do not get enough money to sustain the institutional framework. And in order to sustain it, you have to grow. In order to grow, you have to have an institution, and the whole thing becomes a vicious cycle. Very quickly, you can see them almost as tools and puppets, defined by the expectations of their followers or the needs of their institution. This is the nature of power. And even if it is a spiritual person or institution, this is the nature of power in a consciousness or in a world which is divided, made of pieces. The consciousness of unity, which is not made of pieces, has a very different relationship in exercise of power. What it pours out, because it is unity, what it pours out is always itself. In the human experience, what you act upon is not yourself. And so, what is not yourself equally binds or pulls back on your exercise of your intention. If you act on a large number, let's say you start with 100, you act on 100, but the 100 pull back on you. You act on 1,000,000, the 1,000,000 pull back on you millionfold. The larger the group that you build or lead, the stronger the pushback. Because they're all pieces, and you are one piece among all the pieces. You may have a power which is 10-fold, then you can control 10. You have a power that is 1,000-fold, you control 1,000. But the moment you cross beyond the power you have, you are pushed back by what you control. In a consciousness of oneness, when it acts, there is no other. All action is itself. There is no pushback. All action is freely exercised without anything opposing or resisting. And so it is effortless, and it can go in a million directions, but all directions are itself. And so there is no pushback. It can amplify itself a billionfold, and still there is nothing changed, because all is itself. Always one, indivisible consciousness. And so the action of the undivided consciousness is always one of ease. Even in its millionth action, it is always free. Because there is nothing by which it is bound, against which it has to act. So he describes this same consciousness of existence, consciousness, light, sovereign, rules, free, lord of things, acting out of an inalienable calm. However intense the action it may be, the calm is never lost. The king who rules 10 perhaps struggles a little. When he rules 1,000,000, he struggles much more. Here, however the number, the intensity of the action, it is still in a foundation of the same, inalienable. The calm can never be lost. Pouring itself out in infinite action and quality, out of an eternal self-concentration. So both poises of space and time are included in this single description. Concentration which is across time, eternal, pouring out across space, infinitely. The one supreme person, capital P, holding in himself all this play of personality in a vast, equal impersonality. So at the same time, this consciousness remains impersonal and free as it pours out into an infinity of personalities, possessing the infinite phenomenon of the universe without attachment. Now this is miraculous. In the human experience, if you possess, you have to have a vehicle and a means of possession which binds you, as you bind the other. In a very simple two-person relationship, you watch a person taking a dog for a walk. If the dog pulls hard on the leash, you are pulled. You can't help it. Imagine a relationship where you can guide the movement of the dog and have no pushback, no pullback, nothing. It's a free flowing out. It can only be possible when the dog is yourself. That which you express, that which flows out is your own consciousness. The moment it is separate, there is always something pulling, pushing. So, without attachment, nothing binding, nothing limiting as a result. But without an inseparable aloofness. At the same time, there is also this freedom to be aloof and freedom to pour in, and nothing ever prevents or limits. With a divine mastery and an innumerable radiation of his eternal, luminous self-delight. All facets have been included in a single movement, in a single description. And so the whole universe, from this poise of Satchidananda, is a manifestation which he holds, but by which he is not held, which he governs freely, and by which therefore he is not bound. And so this is possible only in a consciousness of unity, which holds the entire universe and the full diversity as a part of its unity. At no point is it broken up or lost in its fragmentation. This is not the personal God of the religions or the qualified Brahman of the philosophers, but that in which personal and impersonal, quality and non-quality are reconciled. It is the transcendent possessing them both in his being and employing them both as modes for his manifestation. This then is the object of realization for the sadhaka of the integral yoga. So it is this second aspect of the realization of Satchidananda that we seek. But he compares this with the conventional concepts of God, of the religions and the philosophies, and we need to briefly look at what these are. So he says this is not the personal God of the religions. The personal God of the religions is almost as if an exaggerated human personality, except that this personality has now much greater knowledge, much greater power, much greater capacity, skill, reach, etc. If you look at the Greek gods, they were all powerful. They could do pretty much whatever they wanted, but amongst themselves they were in quarrel. Each had some kind of flaw, some limitation, some incapacity. If you see within India, the Puranic deities, the deities as they are described in the Puranic literature, again, humanized, personified powers, still operating on a cosmic scale, able to be anywhere, do anything, but with all the power they have, there is some limitation. And between the various gods, some conflict. Now, why is this? Can we not conceive and have a religion where you can conceive of a perfect God and still make him a human figure, human-like figure, let's say? Is that not possible? Why is it we end up always with a flaw? Precisely because the moment you bring forward personality, and a personality that your mind is able to conceive of, you have to limit it within a boundary. Because you cannot conceive of a personality which is infinite, in which unendingly all aspects of personality would be present. You cannot. So you have to limit it into something which is describable and conceivable. Being finite, you will find very quickly this perfect personality that you have conceived of, having a border and a limit, does not have the other, which is outside your border. And so it will be ineffective or incapable in some circumstance. This is the very subtle trick of the whole play of the divided consciousness. The stories of the Puranas are full of such allusions to this trick. When some great titan, having done great tapas, gets the appearance of Lord Shiva, he is the aspect which is most beneficent. And Shiva says, whatever you ask, I will give you. And the asuras ask for all power or all rule over everything, to be indestructible, whatever he may pick on. And he is granted that. And then afterwards, Vishnu has to come and find a means around this formulation of the boon. And there's always a escape route. Because the moment you formulate the boon, you have put it within a limited frame. And a limited frame always has something which it does not cover. However broadly to formulate. So, famous story of Hiranyakashipu, Titan, who asks to be, he asks that he can never be killed, either in day or in night, neither by man nor a woman, neither by animal nor human, neither in the house nor outside the house, any logically stated formulation which he considers to be complete. And so of course Vishnu has to enter and break this, find the gap in between and come through it in taking the form of Narasimha, which is half man, half animal. He enters, he kills Hiranyakashipu at the transition between day and night, and on the sill of the house which is neither inside nor outside, and so on. The moment you have two pieces, there's always a gap. There's always a joint which is neither this nor that. And in the domain of the divided consciousness, in the manifestation where everything appears separate, you cannot have something that is complete. It will always fall short, it will always have a limitation. So you can conceive of in however complete a way your mind can conceive, there will be a lack, an incapacity, or a flaw or failure in the personality. So, personal God of the religions cannot ever meet this completeness. The other is the qualified Brahman of the philosophers. So the philosophers will conceive of the one Brahman, because there was a problem of the duality and the unity of Brahman. They said, well, there is underlying unity but qualified, that the unity can modulate itself like waves on the surface of the ocean, and so you have multiplicity but underlying unity. And this is the Vishishta Advaita, qualified monism. And that is to be somehow the bridge between the underlying oneness and the multiplicity. But Sri Aurobindo says even this is not it. Because in this poise, you have qualities, and underlying consciousness is quality less, apparently, because the qualities are still, but the surface movement is a play of qualities. This is not still a freedom. It is still the best that the mind can conceive of a consciousness that is free and yet is able to modulate on the edges a movement, but a part which remains separate enough that it feels itself free. But there's a bind, there's the connection that binds and limits. It's not this either, he says. But this is a consciousness in which both personal and impersonal are simultaneously poises and wholly included, and equally the quality and non-quality are both wholly experienced and simultaneously present. It is the transcendent, that which is above all the descriptions of quality and qualityless, personal and impersonal. And it is this using both, not just taking one aspect. The transcendent could also use one single aspect of the qualityed or the qualityless, but using both equally. This is the poise of the mastery, which you will find also described in the Bhagavad Gita by Sri Krishna as the poise that one has to reach. Employing them both as modes of his manifestation. This is the true base in which one can be fully in the world and yet free of all limitations. So this is being set as a goal, and the question now is, well, how do we move towards this? What does it mean practically? This he now takes up. We see at once that from this point of view, the realization of the pure quiescent self, which we gain by withdrawing from mind, life and body, is for us only the acquisition of the necessary basis for this greater realization. So the first step of withdrawing, disengaging, which was discussed in great detail earlier, which brings you to a quiescent experience of Satchidananda, is only a base for this greater. Therefore, that process is not sufficient for our yoga. Something else is needed, more embracingly positive. As we drew back from all that constitutes our apparent self and the phenomenon of the universe in which it dwells, to the self-existent, self-consciousness, Brahman, so we must now repossess our mind, life and body with all the embracing self-existence, self-consciousness and self-delight of the Brahman. So what Sri Aurobindo is doing here is he is placing a double movement, one following the other. The first step, you draw back from the universe to dwell in this Brahman, which is self-existent and self-conscious. Second step, to repossess mind, life and body with the all-embracing self-existence, self-consciousness and self-delight of Brahman. Meaning, this consciousness in which we reached must now reach out and possess. First you let go of what you had to get to this consciousness. Now from this consciousness you go and seize upon what you had before. The difference after this re-seizing is, you are not living on the surface, you are living in the core, from which all the surface movements which you had before are now seen as free expressions of your free consciousness. And this is how we can then live the full experience of life and the full experience of the universe while still being founded in the freedom. So he says, we must not only have the possession of a pure self-existence independent of the world play, but possess all existence as our own. Not only know ourselves as an infinite, unegoistic consciousness beyond all change in time and space, but become one with all the outpouring of consciousness and its creative force in time and space. Not only be capable of a fathomless peace and quiescence, but also of a free and an infinite delight in universal things. For that, and not only pure calm, is Satchidananda, is the Brahman. So Satchidananda is not only pure calm, that is one aspect of it. That full mastery is Brahman and Satchidananda. Now this is a description of that status of consciousness that we have to acquire. But the description itself, you will see, has three sides, three forms in which he articulates it. Pure self-existence, independent of world play, and all existence also as our own. Meaning existence itself has two facets. What we experience as the world, the play in the world, is also an illusion. When you say I exist, the illusionist will say, no, that is your illusion. Even modern science, coming very quickly to the poise of the mental consciousness and its view of the universe, says, well, it's all a creation of your mind. If you close your eyes, you don't even know if the universe exists. You open your eyes and you see the universe. In a sense, you create it in the act of seeing. That's what you come to inevitably if you live in the mental consciousness only. The whole thing is existent from one extreme, semi-existent or non-existent from some in-between poise. But you go deep, you have the deeper existent, against which this looks like non-existence or illusion. But there is this consciousness where the whole thing is existence, taking different positions. The next sentence he uses is from the perspective of consciousness. Not only know ourselves as infinite, unegoistic consciousness beyond all change in space and time, but become one with all the outpouring of consciousness and its creative force in time and space. So we are conscious here, and in our surface little personality, we have some experience of exercising consciousness and will. We can step back and get into a consciousness which is beyond all change, meaning free of time and space. From that poise, the changing surface play of consciousness in time and space appears almost illusory or superficial. But you pour back into it and recognize this consciousness and that are really one continuum, one whole. Just as this existence and that existence were one continuum. And then you have the experience in time and space and beyond all time and space, all in one consciousness. And the third position he describes is from the perspective of delight. You have in your peace and quiescence free and infinite delight in the quietness, but also delight in the universe, in the play of the forms. And the whole thing is one continuum of delight. And so, pure calm is in the center of the Satchidananda, but the whole of Satchidananda includes all of these forms which are on the surface in our mind, life, body play of the universe. But if you center yourself in the mind, life, body play, you do not experience the existence, consciousness or delight. For that you have to find the center of the outpouring. From there then you can experience these as play and form of the existence, consciousness and delight. So the whole journey now has two steps. First, a stepping back to regain this center, and a second stepping forward to regain from the poise of the center, from the freedom of the center, this as real and as an expression of the center. The analogy we may give is of a spinning wheel. At first you're on the edge of the wheel and everything is spinning, everything is moving, nothing is stable, nothing is sure, everything is uncertain. You move from there towards the center. As you come closer to the center, you find the giddiness becoming less, the confusion getting less, until at the center you are unmoving, stable, permanent, calm, from which you can see the full spinning wheel. All the movement is happening around you. You are not moving in your freedom. The second movement is not to move back, losing your poise, is to spread out from this center now, regaining all the movement of the wheel as yourself, as form and expression of your own free center. And at that point you are the totality of the wheel that is spinning. You are in the center, unmoving, and yet you are also in the movement, fully engaged, not in a piece, not in a part, but in the whole. And in the whole, you can focus your attention on a part, never losing the freedom of the poise of the center or the movement of the whole, knowing always yourself one with it all. And so this is the analogy which helps us to fully recognize the difference in these two movements. Now there is already within us a consciousness, not fully developed to our personality, but already present in the universe, which knows this poise. It is the poise of the divine consciousness as it takes this wheel, as it takes this universe. But we are not in that consciousness, we are in the mental consciousness, which is separate on the surface in the movement. And so it would be very easy if we could just switch to that consciousness. We cannot. So this is what he describes now. If it were easily possible to elevate ourselves to the supramental plane and dwelling securely there realize world and being, consciousness and action, outgoing and incoming of conscious experience by the power and in the manner of the divine supramental faculties, this realization would offer no essential difficulties. If you just shift into that consciousness, shift into it where this is normal, this is natural. There is such a consciousness, we know, because the divine himself, as he moves to become the universe, does it in a certain state of consciousness. That consciousness of the divine knowing being is the supramental. If you could simply switch yourself into that, pop, I experience what the divine experiences. Very simple. And not yet a supramental being. It is by the mind, therefore, that he has to aim at knowledge and realize his being with whatever help he can get from the supramental planes. So not only gaining knowledge, but also realizing your own being. Who am I? What am I? And if someone asks you the question, how do you turn to responding or even becoming aware? It's your mind's awareness that you turn, oh, who am I? Limited to mind. If I say, become aware of your divine self, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is, because I'm not able to have an awareness that is of divine quality. So he has to aim at knowledge through his mind and realize himself, his being, through his mind, with whatever help he can get from the supramental planes. Now this part is critical. If this were all, if we were only mind, then it is a bit, perhaps even impossible to ever got anything great. It is like telling a monkey, well, if you try hard enough, you will be able to write a beautiful play. It doesn't work because the capacity is not there. But if you say that here is a human being with whom the monkey can enter into a relationship, and the human being now engages with the monkey and through a series of interactions and activities helps the monkey to enter into the human experience or the human mental awareness. Then perhaps the monkey says yes, because the human being is able to lean down to the level of the monkey consciousness. Monkey consciousness is then able to hook into the human mind on that level and then slowly get pulled up. In practice, this is what happens when apes or dogs or even dolphins, sometimes horses, grow in closeness with human beings, are domesticated and have very close quality of contact of mind. Now, not all of them get mental contact, but some of them do. And if they're already sufficiently developed to be able to connect by their own effort, and if on the other side the human being also leans in, the transition can be made quite dramatically. And you find very quickly the dolphins beginning to relate to human beings almost like human beings, the dogs behaving almost like human beings, and so on. I've had one remarkable experience over the years to many places where people had dogs, and they were of different grades of awareness. Some of them remarkably conscious, some of them becoming conscious in moments when they were changed, or moments when there was a strong poignancy. But in one case, when I entered the house, we were discussing something, and a dog walked across, briefly turned and looked at us, and then on. And in that gaze, felt a conscious human being. It was so aware, so conscious. And it hit you. It was so amazing. And later I went and tried to connect with, but the dog had fear. But it was so aware in its gaze, it would look straight into your eye, and as a conscious being communicating, the only thing missing was the capacity to speak. But you could feel even the touch of thought. It's like when you're trying to teach a dog a trick or interacting with the dog, you feel its emotions, but you do not feel its thoughts. But a more developed thought, you can feel, a developed dog, you can feel a little bit of the thought content. In this one, you could feel the thought as if a human being. It's only one over the years, but I may not much experienced here. But it was so remarkable that I had to take photographs, and it's left an imprint after many years, even now. But that's possible when a dog has a capacity, and on the other side, the human consciousness provides the support. And the same applies in the relationship from the human mind to the supramental consciousness. The supramental consciousness is already here, not far away, 1,000,000 kilometers above the head. It is here around us. We point above because in grade of consciousness or center of consciousness, in our body, the center of awareness is above the head. But the presence is right here. It is at the same time utterly personal as it is impersonal. By definition, that is the nature of the divine consciousness as it relates to the world. And so you can relate to it intimately as a personality, or relate to it as a vast, impersonal, universal action. Both are simultaneously true, and they are not different. They are separate aspects. They are one consciousness that you know as separate aspects. And so you can know it as her, as Shakti, power of the Divine Mother, consciousness of the Divine Mother, in her supramental consciousness. You do not limit yourself to just one form in which, or figure in and through which you know her, but use the figure as the entry point for you to connect to this, which is herself, her body, her consciousness. Where is it? Right here, right now, everywhere. From her consciousness, from her supramental consciousness, therefore, our mind is a part of her consciousness. For her to lean into it is effortless. As a human being can lean into a well-developed animal consciousness and connect, to know, to feel what it feels and to know what it knows. But for this consciousness, it's even more easy because it is one with all that exists. And so her consciousness is intimately one with your mind. From the other side now, the hand reaching down to connect is present. What is missing is your side, the hand reaching out to connect. Your consciousness reaching out to open, to give itself. To allow the contact to take place and to allow yourself to be pulled. But if we were willing to do that, if we make a small conscious effort, then she holds and draws you into herself. And then everything becomes possible. There's a very interesting conversation the mother has where somebody asks her a question like, "Mother, how can we supramentalize ourselves?" or something like that. And mother very bluntly says, "Do you think you can do that? Try it. Try to supramentalize yourself." And she says, "Obviously you cannot do it because there's nothing in you that is responding to it. You cannot will yourself into something that is not there in you. The only way you can do is open yourself to its action, its influence, and invite it. Give yourself to allow it to reshape you." So there's a very important element here of the nature of the effort. The harder you try, the more difficult it becomes. Because your very effort is innately one of a limiting mind and consciousness. I do. What's the movement you do when you do? You narrow yourself, you tighten yourself, you push with your separateness. Exaggerating your separateness as if trying to overcome another separate piece. You should be perfect if you have to push a stone, which is another piece. But when you want to open to the infinite, you cannot seize on the infinite, because the very act of seizing cuts out what you're trying to do. And the only way to seize, if you had to use that word, is to give yourself, let go of your limits, allow it to seize you. And so the nature of the effort, Mother points out, the harder you try, your effort itself becomes a veil that blocks and prevents. And still an effort is needed. The nature of the effort is a letting go and giving yourself. And it's a skill which comes with a building gradually of a relationship in which a trust, growing, deepening intimacy of contact has to be built, in which more and more of you begins to trust and can allow itself to be given. But I am jumping ahead, but it sets us the direction of our study. We have to begin with the mind and recognize that our mind has certain limitations, and yet it can open itself to the help. And so he says, it is by the mind, therefore, that he has to aim at knowledge and realize his being with whatever help he can get from the supramental planes. And that help is there, always. This character of our actually realized being, and therefore of our yoga, imposes on us certain limitations and primary difficulties which can only be overcome by divine help or an arduous practice. And in reality, only by the combination of both these aids. So the character of what we are, I am conscious. Let's use this word, actually realized being. We use the word realized here. Normally we associate the word realized with divine realization or realization of self. But all of us are realized beings having realized our mental awareness. Okay? So that's reasonable enough. I am a mental conscious being, I am mentally aware. That's a state of realization. To the ape consciousness, this is mental realization. So our actual realized being, which then defines the nature of our yogic effort, there are limitations and primary difficulties because we are mind first. And we have to overcome these primary difficulties and limitations by, he says, divine help or arduous practice, in reality by the combination of both these aids. First he puts divine help, because as we saw, you cannot think yourself into supramental. You have to allow it to reveal itself to you, so to say. On the other hand, an arduous practice is needed. Even the act of self-giving requires an arduous practice. It is still a practice, as I said, there's a cultivation of your consciousness to habituate it and to teach it and then to grow in intimacy and so on. That is still practice and it is arduous. It requires a sustained effort. And so in reality, only by the combination of both these aids, these difficulties in the way of the integral knowledge, the integral realization, the integral becoming, we have to state succinctly before we can proceed further. And this is the theme of the rest of the chapter, titled The Difficulties of the Mental Being. But the difficulties in the way of what? He uses three phrases: integral knowledge, integral realization, integral becoming. You observe how they represent three stages of the journey. First, you have a knowledge, meaning an experiential knowledge, not intellectual, experiential knowledge. You experience yourself in or a part of the Satchidananda, the self. That experience can be more and more frequent, more and more complete, more and more multifaceted, and so on. And so it will become an integral knowledge, until all these different facets begin to be real and living truths for you. The reality of Satchidananda is itself, yes, it's there, it's so real, it's so concrete, it's tangible. At first in the mind, which sees the inevitability of it, and then more and more in your intuitive consciousness. And that becomes integral knowledge. And that deepens until some parts of it become permanent. You are now one with it. And so that grows to become an integral realization, from experience to realization. And as you begin to live in it, it's not enough. All your actions must be an expression of it. And that becomes the becoming. And so he uses the word integral becoming. Integrally in all our actions, in all our thoughts, in all our feelings, emotions, energies, actions, it is that one consciousness moving multifacetedly. And that becomes integral becoming. There's a beautiful message that the mother gave. I think it was given to the Sri Aurobindo Society. She said, "To know is good. To do is better. To be, that is perfect." But there are three steps in the same direction. And you see here the same idea. To know is good, to do is better, to be, that is perfect. So these difficulties in the way of the integral knowledge, integral realization, the integral becoming, we have to state succinctly. So the succinct statement is going to be 7 pages. And so he first sets the background and then plunges into the specific things in sequence. Realized mental being and realized spiritual being are really two different planes in the arrangement of our existence. The one superior and divine, the other inferior and human. So as we said earlier, we are realized mental beings. We are realized of our mentality, conscious of it, and able to exercise it at will. At least the elite in humanity. We may not say that of all of humanity. So realized mental being is one plane, and realized spiritual being is what we are aiming to be, a different plane. One superior and divine, the other inferior and human. To the former belong infinite being, infinite consciousness and will, infinite bliss, and infinite comprehensive and self-effective knowledge of supermind. Four divine principles. To the latter belong mental being, vital being, physical being. Three human principles. So four divine principles above, three human principles below, completing to make the seven of the seven planes of the cosmos. What are the four divine? So, infinite being, that is the Sat, infinite consciousness and will, the Chit. So the consciousness has a double aspect, knowledge and power of knowledge. So that becomes consciousness and will. And the third, infinite bliss. The fourth is the supramental, what Sri Aurobindo calls the supramental, and the Veda refers to as the Vijnanam. The infinite, comprehensive and self-effective knowledge of supermind. Now the way he defines it is very important. It is infinite, but it includes all things in it. It is not a detached infinity, it is infinite possessing. So infinite comprehensive. And while being infinite comprehensive, it is not merely awareness of knowledge that is, but effective knowledge, knowledge moving into action, not by depending on anything else, but depending on itself. So self-effective knowledge. So first of all, it is knowledge which is infinite, knowledge that comprehends, including all things in itself, embracing all things. Knowledge that is self-effective, not dependent on another device for its action. Now consider the human consciousness. We are finite. We can only know one piece at a time. We are partial, superficial, not comprehensive. When somebody asks you to do a comprehension test in language, what are they doing? They are trying to see whether a full sentence or a complex sentence or idea stated in that language you can grasp and make one and in depth. So comprehension has the sense of going beyond the surface understanding to a deeper identification in the knowledge. So infinite knowledge, in us we have finite knowledge. Non-comprehensive, we start with superficiality, to dig deeper by layer, general stopping at some point we cannot go further. And third, when our knowledge has to exercise itself, it needs a separate tool of will. And the tool of will is not part of the knowledge. It's a separate piece inside us. So that I can say, I know I should do this, but I find it very difficult to will myself into doing it. Because in my will, there is a drive. In my knowledge, there is a awareness, and they are different. Sometimes the drive pushes, and I can't help doing it, but my knowledge is not there. I have the knowledge, but I cannot actuate the drive. Occasionally, the two synchronize for a while, and very quickly they separate. Because in the very act of being in the drive, I lose my detached and free knowledge. I get so possessed by the drive itself that I inevitably overdo. So sometimes you have a spontaneous inspiration which carries within it a power, and you start doing and everything is fine, and at some point the power is not there and you push yourself. Or the power increases and you get carried away and you don't know anymore what you're doing. There are different operations. But in the supramental consciousness, the knowledge itself is self-effectuative. It is its own power. And at the same time comprehensive and infinite. And this is the nature of supramental consciousness. So 4 divine principles: existence, infinite, consciousness infinite, bliss infinite, and this comprehensive self-effective knowledge that is infinite. And below that, the triple layer of human, mental being, vital being, physical being. All 3 finite. All 3 therefore insufficient, incapable and struggling. In their apparent nature, the 2 are opposed. Each is the reverse of the other. So Sri shows how this works. Your physical body is as if the very opposite of the Sat, the existence, which is infinite, and so on, in a mirror image from below up. The divine is infinite. So, in the apparent nature, the 2 are opposed. Each is the reverse of the other. The divine is infinite and immortal being. The human life limited in time and scope and form. Life that is death, attempting to become life that is immortal. So he's showing you first relationship. The divine is infinite consciousness, transcending and embracing all that it manifests within it. The human is consciousness rescued from a sleep of inconscience, subjected to the means that it uses, limited by body and ego, and attempting to find its relation to other consciousnesses, bodies, egos. Positively by various means of uniting contact and sympathy, negatively by various means of hostile contact and antipathy. So first was existence, and you saw how the 2 are opposite, consciousness and the 2 are opposite, and the third is bliss. The divine is inalienable self-bliss and inviolable all bliss. The human is sensation of mind and body seeking for delight, but finding only pleasure, indifference and pain. And finally, the supramental part. The divine is supramental knowledge, comprehending all, and supramental will, effecting all. The human is ignorance, reaching out to knowledge by the comprehension of things in parts and parcels, which it has to join clumsily together. And it is incapacity, attempting to acquire force and will through a gradual extension of power, corresponding to its gradual extension of knowledge. And this extension it can bring about by a partial and parcelled exercise of will, corresponding to the partial and parcelled method of its knowledge. Further, he says, the divine founds itself upon unity and is master of the transcendences and totalities of things. The human founds itself on separated multiplicity and is the subject even when the master of their division and fragment and their difficult rings and unifyings. Between the 2, there are for the human being a veil and a lid which prevent the human not only from attaining but even from knowing the divine. So here are 2 different domains, almost as if the opposite of each other. In between, something separating, and he uses 2 words, veil and a lid, which prevents you from knowing the divine or from attaining the divine. So once you look at it this way, the journey of the yoga becomes almost obvious. There in the divine are all these infinities. Here are the finitenesses. But mirroring each of those powers and struggling within their limitations. These two can be connected. If that could somehow get in here and infuse itself into this corresponding, then the finite. And bit by part, power by power, you can link each of these. Except that in between is this lid and veil. If you can remove the veil and the lid, then spontaneously this might begin to happen. What creates the veil? What is the nature of the veil? What creates the lid? What is the nature of the lid? All of these will be part of the discussion. And then it will be obvious how they are to be removed and how these are to be linked. But if you think about it in this way, it seems almost inevitable in the evolution itself that everything in the human, being a finite and limited representation of the things which are in themselves infinite and divine above, all these are going to grow in those directions. As they grow, those are going to enter and infuse themselves more and more into these. And at some point, there will be a continuity, a bridging, where right here in our mind, life and body, all those things will pour and act through. Through finite appearances, a consciousness and power that is infinite, and a bliss that is infinite, an existence that is infinite, but will act through the finite appearances and forms. And the bridging of the two is inevitable. If you consider that these three layers that we have grown into, when they were not developed in evolution, there was a huge gap. And evolution has only been filling this gap and approaching to complete the bridge. What remains now as lid and veil is only the last remnant of the gap. If you did nothing, eventually perhaps this would happen on its own in a few million years. If you did something, you can speed it up and make it happen in your lifetime. This is the picture he gives to us, and the picture makes everything appear so simple and obvious. But within this is a very fine and detailed description of how those divine powers are here represented in limitation and in contrary functioning because of the limitation. And it's worth going through each of those to observe subjectively within us what these are and what the corresponding powers are above. It's one thing to study this as an objective observer, as a philosopher discussing, seeing a picture and saying, these are the similar things. It's another thing to introspect within ourselves, become aware of those very functionings and powers, and recognize, this is actually corresponding to that. And in this I can open to that. And experientially then develop a certain aspiration which would allow the linkage to happen more easily. So we'll just take an example. We may not have enough time to cover all these sentences that we read, but we can start with a few today and continue the rest the next time. So first he is describing the existence, the being, which is divine and human. The divine is infinite and immortal being. The human is life limited in time and scope and form. Life that is death, attempting to become life that is immortality. This is the existence of the divine and the human existence as human life, opposed, reverse of each other. So the self of Satchidananda, its existence, Sat, is infinite and immortal being. It simply is utterly space, infinite in its existence, eternal in its existence. Reflecting here in matter, you do not have either of these. You have finiteness and you have fragmentation in time also. So he describes now how that limitation appears. The human life is limited in time and scope and form. So in time we have a beginning, we have an end. That's all we can say of our life. Scope in the expansion in space of what it can live in or act upon, or even where it can be experienced. At the very least, our scope is the earth and the earth's atmosphere. If you go beyond the earth's atmosphere, well, you can't breathe and the life cannot exist. And the third is form. We are limited also in form. And it's really an aspect of space, but we are bound in the limitation of this form. If you chop this form a little bit too much, then the form being damaged sufficiently, it cannot continue. You will see in the various ways that human beings find to harm each other. The effort always is to damage the form, which makes you incapable of living this life sufficiently or even to have a life at all. And it goes in degrees. I was recently watching a television series on Louis XIV. It's a series called Versailles, describing the life of that period and the attempt to realize an ideal in the human domain and the impact it had in reforming society. And one of the things you saw there was how constantly there is the struggle, and when you are unable to exercise your power from the authority of the king, you have to compel it by threat, by force, by pain, by torture. And there is this idea which is placed, for a crime that is so extreme, what torture can we conceive that would be worthy of your crime? Think about it. What are you trying to do? You're trying to break down the form to such a degree that the form is not destroyed and yet suffers enough of a struggle to survive, to match the harm that it has caused. But the truth there is this: we are limited by form. If we were not limited by form, there's nothing which can affect us, remember. And that's the nature of the Sat, of the Satchidananda. You are infinite, you are eternal. Well, what can block you? What can limit you? You can be in all forms and yet free of all forms. You can break all the forms you want. I am still what I am. We will take an analogy here, and it's only an analogy. Consider the air which is here. You create a bowl of any shape, any material. It is automatically filled with the air. The air is inside enjoying all these bowls. You can break the bowl. What happens to the air inside? It's still where it was. It has not gone away. It has not changed. Your bowl has broken, that's all. And the self experiences itself in this way in the domain of forms of matter. I am in this body. You break the body, well, I am still there. You'll remember the famous statement of Ramana Maharshi as he was withdrawing from his body. One of the disciples, a VP, said to him, Master, please don't leave us. And Maharshi says very quietly, where can the self go? It's right here. You knock out the body, the self is still there. You put back a body, the self is still there. As body, in body, without body, it is still self. And so you see the contradiction in the nature of human life, which is bound inside a form, dependent on the form, in time and scope. And because it is constantly under pressure, I use the example of torture only to point out, in fact, this is happening to us all the time. There is all the process of life eating away at our body. From microbes to viruses to activities. If you rub your hand on the table, right now perhaps a few thousand cells have been scraped off from your skin. Just because you did not have the nerves which are fine enough to identify each skin, you do not know it. But the same scraping you continue for half an hour, and very quickly the skin will be raw because the digging in has gone deep enough. You continue still further and you would call it torture. What is happening to you? the exact same processes described in those medieval torture tools are operating on you right now through all of the forms of the universe with which you engage. When they don't overwhelm you, you say, I am enjoying my life. When they become too intense, you say, I am in pain in my life. When they oppress to the point of breakdown, you say, life is destroying me. But it's still happening anyway right now, from outside and from inside. Inside every cell there are processes pushing to break down and the repairs going on to keep up. So life that is death, it's not life really. The nature of that life is it is self-existent, nothing ever opposing it. It fulfills itself freely, with no opposition. Here this life is all the time dying and struggling to keep up. Grow faster than the death can overwhelm it. Life that is death, what is it trying to do? Attempting to become life that is immortality. We push and push as if we might somehow overcome death and become immortal. And so in our mind, we cannot think of and plan for death. We behave as if we will never die. Or if we somehow accept, all right, eventually I have to drop the body, I don't think about it. Or I compensate for it by doing something which will remain permanent, which will be worthy of the permanence that I would have aspired or expected to have. Leave behind something by which I will be remembered, something that will help others, something that will stay immortally in whatever form. So it is life that is death attempting to become life that is immortality. You know, the three things he discusses here are existence, consciousness and bliss, comparing the two domains. But there's a prayer which you will recall, which is a very famous prayer, which says, lead me from darkness, from non-existence to existence, asatoma sadgamaya, from darkness to illumination, tamasoma jyotirgamaya, and the third step, mrityorma amritam gayamaya, from death to immortality. All three are really somehow held in this description of life that is death, attempting to become life that is immortality, because somewhere inside us we are one with the existence of the self. And because that is there, and of that we are a reflection, therefore we know it is possible, or even expect that it should be inevitable, and struggle therefore to find it. As long as our body tissue, our life energy substance, and our mind substance, consciousness, are fragmented and do not recover their underlying unity, this condition is inevitable of a piece struggling against the whole. When in our mind we attain to the consciousness of oneness, when our life energies become a power of that consciousness of oneness, and when our body substance becomes form of the underlying substance of self, at that point we will experience in body form the immortality which is natural to the consciousness that is infinite and eternal. And it is towards this that Sri Aurobindo points as the culmination and fulfillment of the integral yoga, where that permanence is not only in the mind, not only in the life energies, but all the way down to the physical consciousness. Now what that means is, it does not mean the body is necessarily bound in its form. It means it can replace its tissue and material as needed, but the physical consciousness will know its immortality and will live in it. There will be no break, no beginning, no end, no sense of scope of limitation, and no sense of the form binding you and compelling you. The form itself would have the plasticity and adaptability. Now this particular degree of realization of transformation is still far. But before that, the first step of the transformation is in the mental consciousness itself acquiring that status of immortality. That in our mental awareness, we know ourselves eternal, we know ourselves infinite and not bound to form, and then we are able to transition from one body form to another without loss of continuity of awareness. Even I as mind, not merely I as soul, I as mind awareness can build across body forms. And this is accessible to us as we are now. And to some degree, if we work upon it, some of the life energy and its power of action can also similarly be brought into the domain of the immortality of the consciousness. For it to go all the way down to the physical consciousness, the physical and body consciousness to experience immortality will take a little. Said, if somehow we could extend the physical body life to 3 to 4 lives, that would be enough time to complete this process. The process takes time, and especially in the denser physical parts, that process may take much longer. But in our mind, which is aware, it can be done very quickly and well within this lifetime. And so in our consciousness, we must hold this long-term perspective as our objective, not compromising on that, but as our immediate first step, focus on that which is accessible in the mind and emotions, which are our being anyway. We are mental beings, not even physical. We are first mental beings. And in that, to bring about some degree of this is well within our reach. The second step he describes is the consciousness. The divine is infinite consciousness, transcending and embracing all that it manifests within it. So very beautifully put, the consciousness manifests what? The universe, where not outside it, it is within it. It is always within consciousness because there is nothing other than itself. And in opposite terms, the human is consciousness rescued from a sleep of inconscience, subjected to the means it uses, limited by body and ego, and attempting to find its relations with other consciousnesses, bodies and egos, both positively and negatively. So, unlike that consciousness, which is already whole and which holds everything within itself in identity, this consciousness starts with peace and everything else is separate and cut out. So the human, first of all, it's not even consciousness. It was asleep in inconscience, and somehow it has been rescued from a sleep of inconscience. And the phrasing is very suggestive. We were pulled out. We didn't will ourselves out of it. We were unconscious, we were asleep. Something came and pulled us out and made us sufficiently conscious that we wake up and say, oh, I'm conscious. Rescued from sleep of inconscience. If you look at humanity, you'll find such a large part of humanity is still half in inconscience. I was thinking of this recently because I was in a long journey through many spaces, and in one particular case I was looking down from a height at a whole city, cars moving breakneck speed, people rushing breakneck speed, and if you look at what is the awareness in all the people, what are they thinking about, what is their priority, what is their drive of interest, passion, desire, everything is going round and round. The immediate next gratification of my senses, or survival, or habit. And the whole thing is mechanical, unconscious. Very few spots which step back and say, what am I doing? Why am I here? What do I really want to do? That's already a waking up in mind. How many stop to that moment? If at all they do that, it is there for a few minutes, and then ploof, you're lost in the mechanical world which sucks you into it. And you extend that to the whole world. This is the condition of humanity. We're running and running and running, mechanically driven utterly unconscious of what we are here for. But the thing which at that time struck me was just all around here, behind this surface appearance, everywhere is this incredible beauty and delight of the Divine Presence. The Divine is right here, intensely aware of all that you are and all that you're doing and all your drives of mechanical habits and desires and survival needs. It is aware, brooding on you, ready to pour into you all that bliss and delight and knowledge and love. And you are stuck in this darkness of self-lost mechanical whirl, unaware of it. And the point was not even to ask, why am I here, what am I doing? The point is, you're not even aware of this incredible ocean of bliss and love and power and beauty that is all around, waiting to burst through into your life, waiting to give itself. All you have to do is say, yes. You're not even aware of it. And look at the mass of humanity from the time they're born to the time they die, unaware of the Divine Presence. What a huge sleep of unconsciousness and darkness. And even those of us who have chosen a conscious spiritual path, how many moments, minutes, and if you're fortunate, a few hours of time when we are conscious of that and aspiring, feeling, or in some relation, however fine a degree, in some relation with that. So little. Yes, we are trying to grow, but the bulk of us is not involved in that, and very quickly we are sucked into the bulk which pulls us into its mechanical stream. Every day when we wake up from sleep, we are waking up from that inconscience. Not we didn't wish to wake up, we were pulled out from sleep somehow by something, so rescued from sleep, not only in evolution but every morning, rescued from sleep, and we wake up, and the first thing our thoughts go to, what do I have to do, what do I finish, who do I have to meet? And very rarely we stop and say, Divine Mother, Divine Presence, beauty, bliss, love, and all that which is there. And Sri Aurobindo has this statement which goes something like this. I don't have the exact words. He says, this wonderful world of delight waiting at our gates. And he says, waiting for our invitation to enter. It's there. And then in my routine, yes, my time for prayer or meditation, now I sit down and I try. Maybe I remember, but sometimes even that becomes mechanical. I have to finish my prayer in 10 minutes today, I am late. So the human is consciousness rescued from a sleep of inconscience, subjected to the means it uses. So if you're trying to be conscious, you're dependent on your vehicle of consciousness, which is in this case your brain and your nervous system. If somebody sticks a needle into your bloodstream and injects morphine, well, you lose consciousness. You're dependent on the means to remain conscious. If you get a knock on the head, you blank out. If you don't get enough oxygen, you lose consciousness. And if the biology needs to rest, well, you are subject to sleep. Your consciousness is not its own master of itself to say, I will remain conscious irrespective of my brain and biology. That itself is a big achievement when in the midst of sleep, a part of you can remain conscious. Conscious of the dreams. Conscious that you do not wish this dream and change the dream. Conscious that it's time to wake up and consciously able to pull the body out of sleep. To get to that point does not require any spirituality. It has nothing to do with awakening to the self or the psychic being. It's just a mastery of the mind. And in the mind you can develop this continuity of awareness, free of the brain and biology's limitations. And it's possible and people have done it. It does not take much, but it requires persistence and hard work. So, subjected to the means it uses, limited by body and ego. So where is your consciousness? Here. It's not there. And which is your consciousness? I, not the other. That dog who is conscious, those human beings who are conscious, they are not my consciousness. And yet, for the divine consciousness, all is infinite consciousness. But since my consciousness and that other consciousness are really parts of the same whole, so automatically there is tempting to find its relation to other consciousnesses, bodies, egos. Because I am consciousness in body and ego, so others also are out on all those levels. How? A positive effort and a negative effort. Positively by various means of uniting contact and sympathy. Negatively by various means of hostile contact and antipathy. But that's still a form of union. Even hostility is dwelling on the consciousness of the other with a negative thought. And in the dwelling in negative thought, you are causing automatically a connection to form. You're still connecting consciousness in negative form. And you will see most of human life, social life, economic life, political life, most of it is really different frameworks and vehicles to assist in promoting more positive connection or to controlling and limiting the negative antipathy and hostile contact. That's all there is to all of our life. So you create institutions, you create clubs, you create communities, you create families where all these things could happen in a positive way. Where there is conflict, we create diplomatic structures, we create sharing devices, communication systems, that there is not a complete breakdown and destruction, and so on. But everywhere behind the scenes, it's attempt to find again the unity of all consciousness. And the same thing on the third level, which is the divine is inalienable self-bliss and inviolable all-bliss. The human is sensation of mind and body seeking for delight, but finding only pleasure, indifference and pain. And you will see at the back of most of our human drives is the yearning to find some satisfaction. And what is the nature of satisfaction? A tiny piece of delight. When the delight is not there, something is missing. When the delight fills it, you feel full and satisfied. The divine is self-bliss, which is inalienable. Nothing can ever prevent that self-bliss. It is blissful in knowing itself. And all bliss, blissful in knowing all things, which is inviolable. Nothing can happen in the play of the bliss that can ever violate the blissfulness. In the human, on the contrary, there is the self-satisfaction which is always precarious. Suddenly somebody abuses me, I lose my self-satisfaction. Or there is the satisfaction of connection with things, which is also precarious. Something goes out of sync and suddenly I suffer, I have pain. And at best what we manage in terms of bliss is sensation of mind and body, seeking for delight. So we'll take up the discussion of the supramental knowledge and the human knowledge for next time, which will be the week after the next Friday. We will not have the class, but for those who are present, we will have a video of some other talk, which is to keep the continuity of our study. And we will continue this the Friday after. We will have classes on Sundays as normal, beginning with this Sunday and this next Sunday. So Sri Aurobindo has shown us two different planes, domains of our being, how they are as if opposite, and at the same time there is a complementarity and a potential for a continuity, and the gap in between, which is the veil and the lid. And the nature of that veil and lid is really something which permits fragmentation to remain separated from the unity. Even a means by which unity chooses to appear as fragmented. That's the nature of that veil. And so we will discuss how that is to be removed or lifted, where it came from and what happens when we remove it. We can pause here and take up any questions or comments. So if you now take this whole process of introspection, recognizing these emotions subjectively, become aware simply, and realize that each of these is actually a form or a partial expression of that. So our mind's awareness being insufficient, drawing out from inconscience, is really an awareness opening to the all-awareness, a part of the all-awareness. So when you're conscious, you say, I am conscious, my self-awareness is a part of infinite awareness. If I simply relax my sense of I and limitation, this awareness will fall in line with the whole awareness, all awareness. My life, which I feel bound to the body, if I simply relax the limitation, I will experience life, which is all life, cosmic life. And so you feel subjectively, and it becomes a theme of contemplation and even an exercise of concentration, where you as if let go of the sense of limits, let the limits fade away, and it doesn't go suddenly bum, it fades out, and you suddenly begin to feel everything as connected and one unity, of which you are a special focus. And one can stay in that for longer durations, eventually even stay in that in the midst of all activities. And such a person then will begin to feel life of each person as if his own life in a wider and other bodies, his consciousness a part of all awareness which is in the universe, and so on. The sense of my bodily life has behind it the sense of continuity before and after, which begins to grow more and more. And so this can become quite easily accessible to us by dwelling upon it in this way. So we can read this text purely as an academic exercise, oh, these are the differences, or we can see it as a description of our experience of consciousness and the limiting factor which can be consciously let gone of, and an opening into something wider which is already there, which is ourselves, a higher, diviner being. So from the human to the divine, it's only the removal of limitations and an effort to simply turn in aspiration to the wideness and fullness begins that process. We'll continue this then on Friday after next. Oh.